So for Health Central, last year we ran an in-depth feature series on death and dying in New Zealand, and we were really blown away by the response we received. It clearly indicated there was an appetite for a greater conversation around these themes, and that's where this grew from, really, from a want to take the discussion off the page, or screen as it were, and into live debate. So while this discussion here tonight focuses specifically on the end-of-life choice bill, its origins are rooted in a much wider conversation around death and dying. This is a sensitive topic. It's an important topic. It's literally a topic about life and death, and I just want to ask that we give the topic the respect it deserves, and also the respect of the different perspectives that we're here tonight. With 6 panellists, it's not going to work if we all talk over each other, the audience, and it's going to reflect really badly on me as a moderator. So I'd be really grateful if you'd like to speak, you could indicate to me, when I ask you to give your views. Similarly for the audience, just please raise your hand. Thank you. Sorry, oh gosh, that sounds really school-marmish of me, sorry. But without much further ado, we'll introduce what we've been calling our exceptional panel, and I do believe we have an exceptional panel here tonight. I'm thrilled with the calibre of people sitting before you. I think you're really privileged to hear their views on this. So here we have ACT leader David Seymour, the man who introduced Bill himself. We've got sitting beside Kerry Nuku, representing the New Zealand Nurses Organisation. Beside Kerry, we've got Dr. Jack Havel, who's retired intensive care specialist. Beside Jack, we've got Sir Bill English, former Prime Minister. Thank you for coming. And visiting from Canada, we've got Dr. Leonie Hertz, a palliative care specialist. And beside Leonie, we've got Claire Freeman at the end there, who is a health student and disability advocate. So can I just give a round of applause for So I think given the audience we've got here tonight, it's pretty safe to assume we're pretty well versed in the legislation, but I thought I'd just give a quick preface quick 101 if you like, of the end-of-life choice bill. It was put forward by David and pulled from the ballot in June 2017. The bill seeks to legalise assisted euthanasia in a medical setting for people with terminal illness or grievous and irremediable medical conditions, if it is their wish. MPs voted the bill into the select committee. The committee received a record-breaking 35,000 submissions and heard 2,000 submissions, and we're due to hear back from the committee shortly. And it potentially then could go to public referendum. So this is not the first time that euthanasia has been brought before Parliament, with previous bills being considered in 1995 and 2003. And in 2015, former Labour MP Marion Street petitioned to have this investigated again. So that really brings me to my first question for the panel. Oh, I'm not going to stand the whole night. Thanks, I'll get tired on these heels. Perhaps we'll start with you, David. I mean, what is it that keeps us as a society returning to this question? Why is there a thirst to have this discussion about assisted dying?
Well, I think it is resting in people's experience. People ask, why do such a large portion of New Zealanders, and it's consistently 75%, say that they are in favour of change and choice and that they want assisted dying to be legalised? And I can only imagine and extrapolate from all the conversations I've had is that they've had first or at least second-hand experience of somebody who has died badly, and they've said, well, if my time comes, not for me. If I'm in that circumstance and I can't be helped by palliative care, and in the Lucretia Seals court case it was accepted as uncontested evidence by both sides that there are some such people, then I want to be able to have the right to say, I've had a good life, and if it's all the same to you, I want to go on my terms and my timing. It's my choice, and it's my life, and it's my right. So I think it, first of all, stirs very deeply on compassion, because people see suffering and they don't like that and they don't want it for themselves either. but it also reaches very deeply into choice and the idea that I can self-determine and do things the way I want to do it for myself, so long as I'm not harming others. And so you've got two quite strong moral taste buds, if you like, that are activated by this debate.
Sir Bill English, I saw you shaking your head through that. What are your views?
Oh, look, there's nothing new about this kind of issue insofar as it's based on the idea of choice.
Can you speak up, Sir Bill?
Oh, insofar as it's based on the idea of choice, it's dangerous for everybody else. They talk about 70% of the population wanting it. Of those who are in the zone of dying, around 1.5% to 3% of people in other countries choose it, and the other 97% don't want it. They're not asking to be killed, because that's what we're doing. We're crossing a line we've never crossed before. And people may believe that it's compassionate or it reduces suffering, but the cost of doing it is we, for the first time ever, decide that the state will sanction killing. That is, license doctors under certain circumstances to do something which would otherwise be the most serious crime you can do. And the experience of other countries is that creates a lot of risks, particularly for vulnerable people. And if you just want one little example I came across the other day, in Oregon, which only has assisted suicide, which is the hard end of this, where you have to take the pill yourself and you've got to do it at home. They don't have euthanasia. Of all the people who apply for assisted suicide in Oregon, 68% are on welfare. 68% are on welfare. So the high-income, high-educated people want this. I don't think there's any doubt about that. I think that some do. David's right about that. They want the autonomy and control, but it's the poor people and the disabled and the suicidal who end up getting it.
Dr. Hertz, what's your response as someone with the Canadian experience on that?
Yeah, so it's been very difficult to put a fence around it, and I think that's been very clear. Once you let the genie out of the bottle, there was no putting it back in. So we thought we had created, a very nicely defined legislation that would just be people who were, have progressive life-limiting illnesses. These are people who are dying anyway, but that's actually not the reality of the Canadian experience. These are people who end up choosing it who are much earlier in their disease trajectory. They do not have uncontrolled physical symptoms, as the media and euthanasia proponents will describe to you. These are people who want control at the end of life, who are afraid of what dying looks like, and they are looking for a way out, and it's definitely easier to do it with a physician. It makes it more palatable.
I mean,
so over time, I'll just add that we thought we had contained it, but it's a logical progression that we consider new things as we get used to a new moral point of view. And so, for example, in Canada, we've gone from now considering a reasonably foreseeable death is no longer part of the definition of who's eligible. So, in fact, the Superior Court Justice said prognosis is irrelevant in this, and anyone who has a chronic disease or disability is now eligible in Canada. It's paved the way for mental health, and the government-mandated task force is now looking at defining eligibility criteria for advanced directives, mental health as a primary.
It's a slippery slope.
It's not a slippery slope. It's a logical progression of what we consider next. It's been shown already in Belgium and the Netherlands, and now in Canada, we're considering providing euthanasia to children who are considered mature minors. That's teenagers, like 13 or 14-year-olds, who are able, by the doctor's assessment, to make their own healthcare decisions, and parents potentially only find out about it after the child has been euthanized. The largest pediatric hospital in Canada, the Toronto Sick Kids Hospital, has already published the guidelines on how euthanasia will be carried out for these children, and it includes not notifying the parents if the child doesn't want them to.
Yeah.
That's what I mean by a logical progression. And in other countries, they've already expanded from mature minors to euthanizing children when parents are deciding on behalf of babies and young children. So these aren't children participating and making a decision for themselves.
thank you. Dr. Hebel, you wanted to add something?
I just wanted to call up that statement, the Canadian one. I've talked to other Canadian people who are involved in MAID. And there is nobody under 18 is eligible People are talking about it, but nobody at the moment is eligible. When we talk about the slippery slope, there's two things we need to talk about. One is whether societal norms can change. Now, just taking it back a few years, one stage slavery was okay, it changed. At one stage women couldn't vote. Kate Shepherd was called a monster, but that changed, and that's because the people of the government decided that that was a good thing and a suitable thing to happen. Now, it's no use this fear-mongering going on. One of the things with young people who are 18 or under 18 is that they suffer in the same way. And in Belgium, for instance, the parents have to give consent, the carers have to give consent, and just because a group of people get together in Canada and talk about this and make all sorts of suggestions, that's not what's happening.
So it's actually not a group of people. It's a government-mandated task force that is reported back to Parliament.
I know that.
No, this is not a group of people.
But it has not been passed.
And it is coming in the legislation, and we know it to the point that this is published in the Journal of Medical Ethics, what the proposed guidelines are going to be for children under 18, and parents do not have a right to be involved in the decision if the child chooses, and they will only find out after the child has been euthanized. So I beg to differ with you.
Well, I want to bring that. I mean, one thing that fascinates me about this is that evidence can be found from both sides, from different countries. So I want to turn our attention back to the legislation that's in front of us here on the table for New Zealand. David, what assurances can you give us that it's watertight, so that these sorts of so it can't be exploited, as we're hearing it has been in other countries and jurisdictions?
Well, two. I mean, first of all, you've got a huge amount of speculation that's frankly untrue. And what we're already seeing in the first 10 minutes of this discussion is, a tactic that is used around the world, which is fear, uncertainty and doubt. And it explains a very important statistic, which is that a large number of jurisdictions have considered assisted dying laws and had them voted down. Not one jurisdiction that has legalised has gone back, and that tells you a few things. First of all, it's very easy to say, well, the Sick Children's Hospital in Toronto is considering assisted dying for mature minors. They haven't. They have published a protocol for some of their patients.
But do you think our legislation, the bill, is watertight?
Well, sorry, if you want to ask me a question, you've got to be allowed to answer it. And so the first part of the answer to this is that the premise of your question is wrong. I'll just give you one example that we've just heard. The Sick Children's Hospital in Toronto has indeed published a protocol which is for patients of theirs who are over 18, despite being a children's hospital.
So that's actually not true. It's for children under 18.
They have had discussions,
read the paper,
as you would expect people to discuss. I have, thank you. And they have had, some people have discussed what it might look like if the law changed and they were able to have people under 18 accessing assisted dying, but that hasn't happened. So the first thing is, I don't accept the premise that we're going to have the kinds of things that are claimed to be happening are happening. The second thing is, I would say that New Zealand's constitutional arrangements, our culture, and the bill that I've put up are quite different to what you've had expressed offshore. So, number one, you look at the Netherlands and Belgium. Well, their law, when it started out, said that you have to have a situation of hopeless suffering. Well, of course, that is going to be very difficult to contain. It's totally subjective. My bill says that you have to have a terminal prognosis that will end your life within 6 months. Again, in Canada, they say death has to be reasonably foreseeable. Well, our conditions are tighter. And I know people will talk about the second strand of the bill that I have, which says that you can access assisted dying if you have a grievous and irremediable condition. I guarantee you that won't get through Parliament. So it's going to be for people who are...
So why did you put it in there?
Well, because I was more optimistic about...
Who were you targeting?
I was more optimistic about the respect for freedom and tolerance in Parliament than I should have been. So can we...
Oh, so you really want that in?
Yeah.
So you really want to keep the grievous and remedial?
Yeah, Bill, I think there are people who are going to suffer terribly as a result of that not being there. But in any case, if I could just finish, Bill, you don't need to interrupt. In any case, we have a tighter bill in that regard. Secondly, constitutionally, the way that assisted dying got legalised in Canada is that the Supreme Court of Canada said that the parliamentary law is inconsistent with the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. We don't have a Charter of Rights and Freedoms. We do not have constitutional law elevated above Parliament. So the ability to change what Parliament passes is far greater in Canada than it is here. In fact, that's how they got the law and we don't have it yet. Because in the Seals versus Attorney General case, the judge said, quite rightly in our constitutional context, I can't give Lucretia her wish because that would trample upon the constitutional territory of parliamentarians. So there's a couple of reasons there why it's different. And I'd also say our culture is different. There is something about the Netherlands and Belgium where the people who are open-minded and proponents of this in the Netherlands and Belgium would say, we did not go down the slippery slope, we regulated ourselves back up the slope. They had higher rates of informal assisted dying going on before they legalised, so they don't see themselves as having liberalised, they see themselves as having regulated what was already occurring. So look, constitutionally and culturally we're different, the bill on the table is different, but also a lot of the fear, uncertainty and doubt you hear is not true, and that's why it's easy to stop a bill like this being passed. In many jurisdictions the opponents have succeeded, but they've never succeeded in going back once people see what it's really like.
Yeah, and one of the reasons for that is the way the safeguards are structured in all of these legislation, all these different sorts of legislation, and it's exactly the same here. If I can use an example, in Canada there's a waiting time of 10 days, and in 60% of cases that's waived, and in half of the 60% there's no reason given for the waiver. In Belgium, there's a significant proportion, 1 or 2% of euthanasia deaths are now involuntary, right? Actually involuntary, which means someone killed a person who did not agree to be killed. And the real problem is that their structure of supervision, which is similar to ours, allows no way of looking into those problems. In Quebec, the most recent figures show 143 unaccounted deaths related to euthanasia. And there is, because of the way the legislation is written, the end-of-life choice bill in New Zealand, modelled on those others, the principal witness is dead, the medical records are all confidential, and the courts have said they will not second-guess a medical decision. So there's no access to justice for those who are treated so unjustly they end up dead against their will. And of course the threshold for that's very high. We can't pass a law that allows any wrongful death, but that's what's being contemplated. A legal supervision structure which in other countries is allowing dozens, maybe hundreds of wrongful deaths. And of course the euthanasia establishment is not going to, the reporting's weak, the supervision is non-existent in New Zealand, in the New Zealand bill, and the people who do it, of course, are not going to be owning up. Why would they?
Jack.
Bill, you're talking a lot of rubbish. I'm sorry. In Belgium, for instance, there was a paper printed and saying that people were euthanised against their will, but a second paper came out and said they were undergoing treatment no different from what we would be using in our palliative care in New Zealand. In other words, they were having heavy sedation and sometimes palliative sedation. You obviously don't like the idea of end-of-life choice bill, but you seem to like the idea of people suffering enormously at the end of their life, and with no regard to that. And I just cannot understand where you're coming from.
Well, let's ask
Claire,
a sufferer.
I'd like to hear from Claire for a minute on this. Okay, well, first of all, I actually find it mildly offensive
the term suffering, to be honest with you, because, you know, when we talk about this bill, and I know we discussed these 70% of New Zealanders that do want this, and I think we need to look at the bigger picture about why they want this. And I feel it is based around the fear of the suffering. Now, I'm in a position here where I have a high-level injury. I'm a tetraplegic. I do suffer from intolerable pain, and I tick all the boxes. You know, I don't have a dignified life in terms of the fact that I need 24-hour care. But what I can tell you is, having lived or living in that state, it's not something to be afraid of, to be honest with you, because if you have the right support, then, you know, it's actually a wonderful life. My concern is the fact that the over 70% of people that are suggesting that they want this choice, I think they're making that choice based on the fear of something they don't know, whereas I do know what this is like. And, you know, for me, knowing, because I speak to an awful lot of people, you know, with disabilities, I have a high social media profile, and the thing that I'm hearing from a lot of them is, yes, a lot of them do want that choice, just as I did 3 years ago. In fact, I'd be sitting on David's side, to be honest with you, 3 years ago, and I'd be championing this. But what I've realised is that I didn't have the support. And the problem with New Zealand is that people with disabilities don't actually have the right support. Now, we need to be making sure, before we even entertain the thought of a bill like this, that disabled people have the support. Otherwise, they will be choosing an assisted suicide death, because there is no other choice.
Is it a case of either or? Can we not have the support places in place and more funding towards disability support and palliative care and aged care, and the right to choose? What are the panel's thoughts on that?
It's interesting, because I think in a perfect world, I would say yes. I would love to see people have that choice. And that's, you know, that's the truth. I mean, you know, I have to be honest here. I'm secular. I'm not religious, so I don't come at this from a moral perspective. But at the same time, you know, it's. Sorry, can you just repeat that question?
I'm just saying, why does it have to be an either or? Right. There seems to be quite polarised. We need to put auto efforts into improving palliative care and disability, or the end of life choice. I don't understand why we can't have both.
Okay. Well, I think we'd need to address, first of all, the fear society has about disability and about dying, because whether we like it or not, you know, the discourses around disability and terminal illness are predominantly negative, and they have been for a long time, and that's, you know, that's increasing with time, because we do live in a neoliberal world. This is what my PhD is about. So I think it would be very hard to change that paradigm of thinking for people to be okay with, you know, with the idea of dying, if that makes sense.
Thank you. I'm interested in the nursing perspective here, Kerry.
Thank you for waiting.
We've talked a lot about support, and you know, nursing staff plays a very important role in that end of life care space. What are your thoughts?
First of all, we represent 52,000 nurses throughout the country, and we hear a lot about palliative care and aged care, and actually, in fact, there is very little attention paid to primary health care, which is fundamentally where a lot of frontline services supported. So how far back do I go? So first of all, I said that we represent 52,000 nurses throughout the country, of which there are 4,000 Māori nurses, health professionals. And we've talked a lot about the support and resourcing, and I think it must be both. There must be resourcing to palliative care, and aged care equally as important is primary health care, where a lot of the entry point is for many patients, which often is underserved. So we've taken quite a, not a neutral stand is what I see the question saying, but actually a progressive position because of the international research that shows that, well, it might be intended that the legislation was never going to be substituted or the nurse take on some of that role. In actual fact, across many of the policies that are presented from government, nurses take a primary role, and a lot of that work does get delegated down. So our reason for taking a proactive, progressive, principled approach is that we are clear, based on legislation throughout the world or different country jurisdictions, that there will be some type of assisted dying at some stage. And what we wanted to do is put nurses front and centre to that, and we don't want to get delegated work that we don't have any influence over, protecting the profession and our scope of practice. So while we're sitting at this table, what we're keen to do is make sure that there is free, prior and informed consent and that the discussion must happen. What I don't see is a lot of Māori engaged in this discussion, and certainly from a cultural perspective, that must happen on marae with our people, because our view of dying, we're all born to die. And so our way that we look at health and well-being is under this umbrella of well-being that gets us on that final journey. So we don't treat it as from a Western view to be afraid of. We talk about it, it's part of our collective decision making, it's part of our engagement, the way that we engage with whānau, but that must be front and centre. And what we're keen to do as nurses is to have the discussion with patients and not just from a nursing professional perspective. And I don't think we've moved it to that space yet. We've talked about it amongst professions.
I found the nursing stance quite fascinating on this in your submissions. Interestingly, the New Zealand Medical Association has argued that doctors are only included in the assisted dying legislation to provide, and I quote, an unnecessary cloak of medical legitimacy. So that's a different stance again. So, I mean, I'm curious about the panel's thoughts on that, if anyone has any thoughts on why, there's a variety of opinions across the medical profession, but that is one thing that's come out. Jack?
Well, the first thing is that I've been involved in 2 surveys, and it's about 37% of the doctors in New Zealand are in favour of assisted dying, and another 10 or so percent or 13%, that sort of region which are unsure, and more than 50% are against at the moment. But that's been standard for all legislation. What was the other?
So it's about the unnecessary cloak of medical legitimacy. Right?
Yeah,
So by adding the...
I think, personally, I think that's a lot of rubbish. The New Zealand Medical Association represents only 20% of the doctors in New Zealand, and they've got some people on their ethical committee and within them which are dead against, sorry for the pun, but are very much against end-of-life choice. And I think that's a stupid statement. Okay. And basically doctors need to be right in the centre, and as do nurses, health practitioners, and because they're the safety agents. They establish the criteria, make sure that people are safe in terms of gut capacity and all that sort of thing. And when the actual deed is done, you need to have that sort of professional competence, because basically it's a bit like giving an anaesthetic, only you're giving overdose.
It is designed to give it a cloak of legitimacy. Actually, Jack, it's not that they're against choice, they may be, but they're just against doctors killing people, because that is the fundamental shift. The choice has always been there. This legislation does one clear thing legally and technically, and that is allows doctors to kill people under certain circumstances. Now, the fact is, when you look at the process and the so-called safeguards, there's very little medical content in it. The terms in the legislation are not medical. Grievous and irremediable is not a medical term. Terminal illness is anyone's guess, as doctors can tell you, because they're often wrong. There's almost no ability to predict that sort of thing unless you're right in the last few weeks. And the process is the process doesn't require medical diagnosis. If someone walks into a GP surgery and says, say it was Claire on a bad day, and I'm sure she's had many, because people's will to live fluctuates, particularly if they're older or vulnerable or young and suicidal, There's days they'd rather be dead. Haven't you ever heard people say that? And guess what? 2 weeks later, they're happy to be alive. That's how we are as humans. We've probably had those thoughts ourselves. They can just walk in, and if they say, I want euthanasia, there's no medical role that balances that. So the safeguards don't include, for instance, making sure the person is getting the services they should have for their psychological state or their physical state.
Can I also...
The process of killing them is the same one they use for the death penalty in the US, where it's carried out not by doctors but by technicians who apparently bumble it so much now that they're trying, a whole lot of people are trying to get rid of the death penalty.
I can see a lot of people aiming to talk. Claire, I think you actually had...
Yeah, well, it's interesting because, I know through research 80% of health professionals would not want to live with my condition. Now, my experience when I was suicidal, because obviously I have tried suicide attempts a few times, my experience is I was never asked by those health professionals that I went to see, and this is in suicide outreach clinics, so these are the people on the front line who should have an idea. I was never asked anything about the context of why I might be suffering. There was an assumption made, oh, she's a tetraplegic, she's in pain, this is something that she would want because that's something I would want, because there is not the understanding about, about the other issues that might be at play here. And when you look at the fact that 80% of doctors think that someone like me should die, that to me says everything, because that really encapsulates the.
So what I'm hearing quite a few times actually is that we need to be having a broader discussion about death and dying before we jump to this bill. I mean, David, do you agree with that? Do you think we've arrived at this point prematurely?
No, not at all. I think that this is the result of 20 years of debate. I mean, it was 1995 that the first bill was put up in Parliament, and it went down, if I remember rightly, about 58-30 or something, so about 2 to 1. It's now 16 years since Peter Brown's 2003 Death with Dignity bill, and that went down by, I think, a margin of 2 votes, so it closed right up. And then in late 2017, the End of Life Choice Bill was passed by a margin of 76 to 44. Thank you, ma'am. You should get a job in Parliament. While we've done that, 130 million other people have all come to live in a jurisdiction where assisted dying is legal. And I think that's really what's changed. So there's been a global conversation, there's been a New Zealand conversation. This is far from premature. It's now overdue. Apart from anything else, the Aussies are beating us now.
Leonie, I'm interested in your views on this, about the broader conversation around death and dying, and do we need to have it? And do you feel that in the Canadian experience that you'd had that sufficiently before arriving at your legislative?
Well, I definitely think as an international society we need to talk and help people be less afraid of what death and dying is. And I think many of you may have heard a speaker who came recently, Catherine Mannix, who's a palliative care physician who's helping people understand what, it's fear of death that people are really worried about. So to help people better understand, and what the issue is about care. And so people actually don't understand what care can look like at different stages of an illness and have access to care. And we're resorting in Canada now to offering euthanasia rather than offering care. And that's a reality. We have medical students and residents who a patient expresses a desire or an interest in death, and right away we assume that they're asking for euthanasia without actually exploring what's underlying the cause of the suffering and what are they actually going through and how can we support them as a person. And I don't think that we support someone in their suffering by eliminating them.
So what does a better palliative care system look like?
Sorry?
What does a better and an improved palliative care system look like? Where are we failing? Perhaps, Kerry, that's...
Well, I mean, it's across all primary care providers, and every clinician, not just physicians, nurses, social workers, volunteers, everyone should be able to provide a palliative approach to care, which is just good care, which is, we talk about advanced care planning and the rights that patients have and families to make choices about foregoing medical treatment if they don't want to prolong their life. You don't have to have that third round of chemotherapy, and you don't have to live, extend your life conditions that are impairing your quality of life. So there's basic conversations that need to happen across society with everybody about palliative approach to care, and then we need another level of care in primary care to be able to help people address the sources of their suffering in a more meaningful way. And then you need access to someone like me who's a specialist when things get really complex, and you need that expertise.
Because you talk about complexities in palliative care. I mean, we hear about palliative sedation, passive euthanasia, and this is where it gets...
So it's actually not fuzzy at all. In fact, palliative sedation is very clearly only to be provided in very strict circumstances in consultation with a palliative specialist. The standards for palliative sedation are set internationally through frameworks, and it is only to be used in the last days of weeks of life. We're actually very good at predicting prognosis in the last days to weeks of life. We're not good at predicting prognosis for anyone outside of that time frame. And the reason for the criteria for palliative sedation is that you have suffering that cannot be relieved through any other medical treatment, and so you need to make sure you've actually exhausted all those medical treatments through checking with an expert to make sure there's something you haven't missed that you can consider, and they're imminently dying from their underlying condition, and it's therapeutic sedation to a level that makes the patient comfortable where you're monitoring for side effects. And there's been multiple systematic reviews and randomized control trials that have evidence-based to show that we do not shorten life when it's used in that context. It keeps a patient comfortable until they die from their underlying disease. You're not withdrawing hydration and causing death from dehydration because you're only doing it in those last days of life, and that is accepted internationally. So it's actually, the only confusion is if people don't understand what is being spoken about by palliative sedation and are using it inappropriately, and that's actually malpractice.
Jack, I'm curious about your views on this from someone who's run an IC unit.
Well, in ICU, we regularly kill patients. When a patient is futile at the end of we can't offer any more treatment, and we're harming them by continuing. So suppose they've got a severe head injury, or suppose they've got end-stage respiratory disease, all that sort of thing, or suppose they've been on cardiac bypass for end-stage respiratory disease, and they've after a vicious flu, and their lungs don't get better. We withdraw life support, and if you like, we kill the patient at a time and a date where we decide after discussion with the family and without consent from the patient, usually because they're heavily sedated. So there's that. The other thing is that this palliative care and palliative sedation, we know that palliative care doesn't work to relieve adequate pain in 10% of patients. That's well established by palliative care people themselves, particularly in Australian studies. But to say palliative sedation, where you've got heavy sedation in a patient that doesn't encourage death, is rubbish, because we know that if a person's heavily sedated, they aspirate and they get it into their lungs, they get pneumonia. If they've got end-stage respiratory disease and they have drugs, their CO2 goes up, and there's all sorts of things like this. And to say that it really annoys me that people have slow euthanasia in this way when they could have a good death while they're fully awake and talking to their relatives 2 or 3 weeks before they're dying. And talking about killing, these patients are going to die in a few weeks anyway. And
the difference, okay. the difference is this: that there's a number of aspects of all that I'm sure the clinicians are going to debate, and I'll probably listen to the current expert. But the difference is this: the current law, without the end of life choice bill, means that if you do that action, which you call killing, and if you call that killing, I don't know why pro-euthanasia people are so upset with us calling what they're advocating killing, because it actually is killing. It's clearly killing. It's a doctor putting a lethal injection actively and consciously into someone with the intent of ending their life. That's killing. But under the current law, if there was any aspect of coercion or maleficence on the behalf of the doctor or any party to that death, that would be subject to the scrutiny of the law. And that is why you have a ban on killing, and we've had it for thousands of years. If you take a life, it's subject to the scrutiny of the law, and the law can be harsh or merciful in its judgment of it. When we pass the end of life choice bill, there's a group of people, doctors, where if they kill someone, there is no scrutiny. You can't scrutinise it. I mean, Kerry talked about families. Families are, in this law, can be totally excluded from the death experience of the mother who is feeling like a burden to their busy children. The law will enable her to totally exclude the family. That's just one aspect of it. But you can't scrutinise what happened in that death, and that's the fundamental legal and philosophical shift that this is about. It's fundamentally about allowing someone to kill someone else without any scrutiny or accountability.
So is that right, David? Is there no scrutiny, accountability?
Look, Bill and I have debated this practically from Gore to the other end of the country. And Bill makes the same argument every time.
But have you answered your question?
And, you know, ma'am, if you want to join the panel, you come and take a seat right next to me.
So what are the safeguards?
Answer the question, please.
Yeah, well, you know, the only thing stopping me from answering the question right now is you.
Okay, thank you.
So,
it's here.
So would you like me to answer it now? Yep.
Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. No more interruptions?
Thanks,
Great,
David.
okay. So Bill makes this argument, and it goes like this. There is no scrutiny because the courts somehow won't check on a case of assisted dying in a hospital, and he mixes up some stuff that's happened around the abortion law, which he's got wrong, but he says that anyway. And then he effectively tells us that if you die in a hospital and a doctor was involved, the courts and the police somehow can't investigate. And my question to Bill is always, well, first of all, if that's true, that hospitals are almost law-free zones where doctors can do anything to you and there's no legal safeguards around it. Well, you were Minister of Health for several years, you were Prime Minister for a year, why don't you do something about it? He can't sincerely believe that. And second of all, he's just wrong when he says there's a group of people who can end your life without any kind of scrutiny. They can, if they carry out a series of procedures which are all documented, that two people go through blind selected from each other. The first doctor is not connected with the first one. They're independently selected by the Ministry of Health. They have to document everything that they do. And the registrar and any other medical professional that they're required to consult with, any family members they speak with, are all a party to what happens. So let's just go through what would actually have to happen for there to be anything untoward here. Two doctors, independently selected of each other, would have to engage in a conspiracy to misdiagnose, to ignore every single sign that perhaps the person didn't want it. They would have to do something that is so pernicious that if you wanted to do that, if you were one of those doctors or a family member that wanted to do it, it would be vastly easier to do it if this law didn't exist. So ultimately, what we're talking about here is a piece of legislation that will protect people far more than what we have now. And the arguments that Bill puts up, frankly, just just do not hold water on so many logical tests.
I'm sorry, that is a complete lie, because I have been there, I have spoken to the health professionals, to the doctors. There are no safeguards, because currently they're not even asking those questions.
Sorry,
and if they're not even asking them now, and that's without the bill in place, how do you think that they're going to be asking those questions when someone who is vulnerable goes to them to end their life because they don't have any support?
Well, the answer is the law will require them to. I mean, that's why we're putting
It doesn't.
They have to follow the law.
Yeah.
No, it doesn't require them to ask a simple question of Claire, who turns up in a severely depressive mood because she's had a week of bad pain and says, I want to be killed. They don't even have to ask her if she has access to other services. They don't even have to ask her. There's no requirement for that.
Black and white. They have to ask if they have explored other options and alternatives.
Okay.
They have to discuss.
Yeah.
And 2 doctors have to do it, Bill. I mean, you're just...
So in
presenting
Canada, we have
what
the
it
same
says in black and
legislation,
white.
which we know you've made a lot of references to Canada in your executive document. And I can tell you what it's like in Canada. And you have to have the same thing. You have to have 2 independent physicians. The reality is we have fewer and fewer providers who want to do this because it changes you as a person when you kill someone else. And we have data in Quebec to show that the number of practitioners who are willing to do this is less. So we have a problem of access in Canada. And it's very impossible to have these 2 assessors be independent. So even though you try to achieve that, it is not possible. The second is assessing capacity is so difficult, and there's no formal training or requirement for how you assess capacity, when and if you need to involve psychiatry in a capacity assessment. None of that is happening in Canada, and it's going to be the reality you're facing too. You're not going to be assuring yourself that and we thought we had it nice and tidy in our legislation, and the reality is the safeguards are not there. There's a checkbox that says, did this person have access to palliative care disability services? Yes or no. If you check no, nothing happens. It gets retrospectively seen, 30% of people didn't have access to disability services when they should have, but there's no stop mechanism to say, don't proceed any further beyond this part until we've reassessed and ensured patients have access to proper care, so they're not being made vulnerable to choose and be demoralized and become afraid of that they're going to live in pain because of the experience they're having now and feeling a burden to other people. So it's not about physical symptoms.
Because the implication of what you're saying is that it is widely known that a large number of physicians are easily implicated in breaking the law, committing murder, which is what it is if you don't follow all the procedures in the bill. And no one's doing anything about it? I'm sorry, but that is just absurd.
Well, that's because it's not happening yet. But the procedures are so... Yeah, well, actually in Canada, there in Quebec, there's 140 unaccounted for deaths in the hospital system that are labelled generally euthanasia, but no one... What's the worst in Canada, and this is what will change our country, is over there, no one is inquiring into that.
That's right.
And you'll get the same thing here. So you talked about the family being involved. That is complete nonsense. If my mother got euthanized on Friday, I get an email from someone on Tuesday, if I'm lucky, because actually no one's obliged to tell me at all. No one at all is obliged to tell me when my mother...
Your grandma didn't want to tell you.
She didn't. Why. That's right. So I don't know. And then if I do find out, because someone who shouldn't told me, and I go, that's funny, because a week ago she was great. And now she's dead. And I'd like to find out how that happened. And you know what the answer is to that? You can't. There's nothing you can do to find out. And if I suspect that my busybody brother-in-law put pressure on her because he wants to get his wife's share of the assets, what David's law says is the doctor may talk to someone who might know whether she was coerced. May talk to someone who might know whether she's coerced. There's nothing in the law that says they have to do anything else. So Grandma can get in the door on the day she feels bad, she's on the conveyor belt, I find out after she's dead, and no one can look at it. And actually the other thing that was said that was incorrect is New Zealand law is really clear, based on the abortion law precedent. because that's where the lawyers defending the doctor who did it will go to that precedent, absolutely, because it's the only precedent. And it says, first, we will not second-guess a medical decision, and that's defined as a medical decision in statute. And secondly, if you're not part of the statutory scheme, you have no status to bring judicial review. And that means no one in anyone's family can review the process. The registrar can't. The registrar has no power of review or investigation.
Yes, they
None.
do.
No, they don't.
You've misread the bill.
They don't. They just publish, they run a filing cabinet and publish data. And I'm appalled that the New Zealand Parliament could even think that that is safeguards when I think of all the safeguards we do about occupational safety and health in the workplace, all the trouble we go to at schools to make sure everyone's safe. You can't use your mobile phone when you're walking on the tarmac in the airport. You know, we go to enormous trouble to protect people from themselves, except when we're killing them.
Thank you. Kerry, you wanted to add something?
I think there's been so much said that I don't know how to keep up with what's being said, you know what I mean? But what I do know is this is Aotearoa New Zealand. And I know what happens overseas is what happens overseas, and I know that we must take some stuff and learn from it. But what I see every day is Māori not accessing healthcare services, Māori not being privileged, Māori not being here, Māori not being part of this conversation, and yet Māori are dying many years earlier than non-Māori. So when it comes to casting any eyes on this, and I know that you've referred to currently Māori die early, and they don't get a choice, they don't get a decision. Decisions are being made for them, assumptions are being made about them before they even front into the surgery. So there must be some competency, some training and education that's provided, and this legislation does allude to that. Now, I'm sorry, but we're at the Waitangi Tribunal fighting for equity, fighting for a system that doesn't recognise these vulnerable populations. They don't consider themselves vulnerable, but they're labelled vulnerable. They want to live in an area of wellness, but they can't access services at the same rate. They're compromised because they live in rural communities. What they want to do is the ability to engage in this discussion. We see very small numbers use palliative care. They get nursed at home. So how do we support them at home?
That leads to quite nicely. We've had quite a few questions ahead of tonight's discussion submitted from our readership. And there's one that I wanted to...
It's okay if Clara wants to say something.
Oh.
Yeah, sorry. Can I just, I mean, as somebody with a disability and as somebody who has a pretty good pulse on, you know, the disability sector, and as somebody who is part Māori myself, I'm Ngāpui, my hapu is Ngāti Korokoro. But that aside, you know, I hate to say it, but we are vulnerable. And we do see ourselves as vulnerable because we are, you know, we go through incredibly vulnerable periods, more so than any other population. It's obvious because, you know, there's a sense of grief, there's a sense of trauma when it comes to things like serious disability and things like, you know, serious illness and terminal illness. So it is a vulnerable population. And the crazy thing is that we're not talking to those populations. We're talking to the majority of people, but even a Dunedin study that came out very recently within the last month or so said, yes, they've done a meta-analysis of all the surveys that have happened, and they've said, yes, 70% of New Zealanders do want this, but actually what they're suggesting, what they're concluding is, but hey, we haven't spoken to the disability sector, who are the ones who are affected by this bill. And to be honest with you, the disability sector is terrified. And also, you know, I speak to a lot of young people, and what really scares me is these young, beautiful people that that get in contact with me through social media. They say to me, oh, you know, I probably would choose assisted suicide because, you know, they're going through that 1 to 5 year period of grieving. And I'm like, well, so we're going to lose a whole, you know, portion of our population who are vulnerable at that point. So it is about vulnerability. This is all about vulnerability, you know. Sorry, Jack.
I just want to make one thing clear. Now, Claire's been, I'm not trying to be rude to you, Claire, but you wouldn't have been eligible for assisted dying under the present bill. being disabled in itself is not the other thing I just want
It's a
to
grievous and irremediable
I
condition.
just want to point out.
How do you know that I don't qualify? Please tell me, because obviously you know everything about my medical condition.
Well, the other thing I do know is that you're not a high quadriplegia.
I would say C4 is pretty high.
No,
I may not be on a ventilator.
a high quadriplegia is something where a person can't breathe and they can't move their arms. And
I can't get my arms over my head. I have 24-hour
but you can work. Yeah, but
Okay. I think.
Sorry.
Okay. I think it's
Well,
a juncture
I
to
think-
take some questions from the floor if anyone has any. Otherwise, I've got some from the panel.
I just want to make a statement.
Just before you do,
I just want to make
Kerry
a
would like
statement
to-
that I'm Māori and I represent 4,000 members, and none of us consider ourselves vulnerable because we're Māori. We're vulnerable because of circumstances and because of the obstruction and the racism within a system, but I am not a vulnerable person.
Thanks, Kerry.
And I
Lack
think,
access to care.
and the other bit about the vulnerability is this, and this is the sort of, the majorities matter in democracy, but we spend a lot of time limiting the ability of the majority to push its view on the minority. That's one of the fundamental tasks of our parliament, actually, is to strike that balance. And that's why, while David thinks 70% of New Zealanders should determine this, we should be at least as concerned, and in my view, much more concerned, about the much smaller number of people who are in the zone of dying. 98% of whom will never choose this, but because they're in the hospice where euthanasia is being delivered, in the hospital where there's a euthanasia team that deals with people who come in asking for it, because they're in the rest home where there's euthanasia happening just down the corridor, they are vulnerable. And that's why their voices should be heard. Māori, the Pacific Voice, is starting to get quite angry about this. The disability community, as you've heard described, is, quote, terrified. And personally, I give more credence to their view than to the proponents of the Bill's view, none of whom appear to me to be terrified because they just see it as a matter of choice. But our history as a democracy is when people are terrified and vulnerable, we show them kindness. We don't set out to make it easy for them to get killed.
David just wants to respond to this point, and then we'll come to your question, I promise.
Yeah, I just make a quick comment, is that one of the things I found in this debate is that in every group of New Zealanders, there are people who are for and there are people who are against. So there are religious people for and against this. There are atheists for and against this bill. There are disabled people who are opposed to this bill. There are disabled people who are in favour of this bill. You can go through the whole tranche. Now, you may not know, but I too am Ngāpui, Ngātu Rehia Te Hapu. And one of the best contributions to this debate I've seen so far was in Timaru. And poor old Nick Karaka, the National MP, got up and said that euthanasia was foreign to Māori and that there was no place for it in the Māori worldview. And what he didn't expect was that there was a guy who stood up and spoke beautifully, gave his mihi, and then gave a very interesting and detailed view of how tikanga, particularly with respect to death, had evolved, and how his own mind had changed. And I thought he made the point beautifully that nobody has, and we've had quite a lot of this tonight, by the way, there's Canadians for and against it too. Most of them are in favour, that's why they changed the law. But there are people for and against this issue in every group, and I think it would be wrong for anybody to say, I somehow speak for a whole group of people.
You've been very patient. Your question, please.
Thank you. It's been very interesting. I would like to ask Claire a question, but before I do, I'd just like to finish what you were talking about with regards to the research of Dr. Jessica Young at Otago University. You're quite right, she did identify that there were gaps in the surveys, one being the disabled community, which are very vulnerable, and the other that has not been surveyed separately is the other extremely vulnerable community, which is the one close to death. They have not been surveyed for their opinions separately. Now, apart from making that comment, I just wanted to ask you a question. The tenor of your talk was that if people had the right kind of support, that's all that's required, the right kind of care and support, that's all that's required, then they wouldn't want an assisted death. I wonder if you have thought that the 70% of New Zealanders who do want the choice of assisted dying are actually not in favour of it because of lack of support. It's because they have witnessed with their own eyes appalling deaths where the person dying had every possible means of compassionate support, and yet their suffering was overwhelming, and all they were asking for was end it, but there was no way to end it other than by hastening death. Have you wondered if it's not fear, but actually having witnessed things?
Yeah, and that's a great point that you make. And I do feel, when I think about Lucretia Seals, I often think, should we do this? Wouldn't it be great if we could address those situations? And to be honest with you, I would love to be able to say yes. If someone is in that situation, then they would have that choice. To be honest with you, I've got to be honest. But the fact of the matter is that, this isn't a perfect world. And yes, there will be people where it will be wonderful to have this bill in place. But there's an awful large proportion of people that will also be carried into this, that will die because of this bill. And I guess we need to weigh up, See, I've also done a lot of research into, I've watched Catherine Mannix and her stuff, and she does talk about the death process, which is really interesting. It's something I never thought of either. And one of the things she discusses is the way that we die, and how when somebody is dying, I myself have done the death rattle a few times. My mother can contest to that, and it sounds terrifying and it sounds horrible. And she thought that I was suffering, but the reality is that when I'm in that state, I am deeply unconscious. I'm in a coma and I can't feel that pain. But for those onlookers, it does look like you're in pain. It does look like that, like it's a horrible death, like it's awful. But that's because we lack the understanding of perhaps what death really is. I don't want to dismiss those people, and I do feel that you do make a valid point. But like I said, this isn't a perfect world, and there will be sections of our population that are vulnerable. And if I could wave a magic wand and say, let's just create a bill for those people, I would love to do that. But I just can't see that happening.
Well, and that's exactly the context that palliative sedation is appropriate to use for. So if you have uncontrolled symptoms at the end of life that aren't being managed with the usual way, that's when people are able to use palliative sedation at a therapeutic level to keep them comfortable. And there's robust evidence-based medicine that shows it does not hasten death when used under those strict circumstances.
Not even after 14 days?
So 14 days is typically the limit we use. So that's right. So people can actually live up to 3 weeks without dehydration. So the evidence in the literature will show that 14 days feels long. Feels long when you're going through it, right? Yeah.
14 days is a long time.
It's a long time, but it's a long time.
Here's an anecdotal. It's along this thread submitted from a reader. She says, I believe I would have cared for close to 1,000 palliative patients in my time as a nurse. Of those people, I can think of one patient where I felt the situation was hopeless and she would have benefited from physician assistance as she starved herself to death in the end. So my question to the panel is, should we have legislation available for the benefits of cases like these, the very minority, even if that's 0.1%?
It's a lot more than that. It's something like 10% who have bad deaths even under good palliative care.
Can you tell us where you're getting this evidence from? Because
it comes
I'm very
from a palliative.
familiar with current evidence-based, and I have not seen any evidence that would support what you're saying.
It comes from the Wollongong University, and it's done by the palliative care society in Australia, and they've done huge studies
it's true,
on
10%
this.
can have difficult to control pain, but we've come a long way in palliative medicine, and I'm currently the vice chair of the Royal College
Are you
Specialty
talking about
Training Program.
Canada
So
or Australia?
I'm very familiar with Australia as well as
Leonie,
the
is
Canadian
there further we
context.
can go with palliative care? Do you think we're making advances to
So I'm just saying that I disagree with this 10% have uncontrolled symptoms,
Well,
and in
listen,
fact, it's not those people who are asking for euthanasia, and we have advanced a long way in being able to help people be comfortable.
on.
And so I think that's maybe old literature.
I've also I reviewed all the I reviewed many submissions in the Health Select Committee, and a colleague of mine and and myself wrote a book on bad deaths in New Zealand, and many of them were in palliative care, and many of them were having palliative sedation. And there were many nurses who worked in palliative care who were also saying they saw many bad deaths.
I guess the question is, what do we mean by a bad death? And this is the part I think that Claire is speaking to, that we just don't really know what dying looks like.
Everybody knows what a bad death is.
Actually, you know, medical students graduate without seeing a person die. And so it's very difficult for us to have physicians understand what normal death looks like.
Kerry.
And we've extended life at all costs.
Sorry, thank you.
I think the answer to your question is no, and this bill is a very good example. When people think of that situation, right? That's what most New Zealanders, out of their normal Kiwi compassion, are motivated by when they think about this issue, and that is the cases that have been referred to, and I'm sure by this lady over here. And the reality, though, is that's not what this bill does. This bill does not confine it.
So do you think there's there's a way of changing the legislation so that it does give an avenue for...
No, I don't. Because
you don't think there's any way...
No, because there's no example in the world of legislation where you can lift the ban on killing and you do not end up in the logical progression to broader and broader criteria, which amounts to the wider population having views about who can live and who can die, and giving the power of life and death to doctors. So when you look at the other jurisdictions, there's none in which it's the case that you've got law that applies only to those very hard cases. And there's in every jurisdiction, you've now got a much larger number of people who are choosing euthanasia, often while they're still relatively healthy, for what are called existential suffering. Like, I'm worried that I'm a burden, I fear not what's happening, I fear what might happen because someone told me about it. And that is the facts, and no one can dispute those facts. If you had a jurisdiction where it was just applied to that group, then I'm sure we'd be hearing about it. But when you look at any of these, it's simply not the case. And of course, once you shift it, you change the assumption about all sorts of vulnerable people. So when we're doing public debates, the example that often comes up is dementia. People are worried about having to watch their parent go through what could be years of dementia and the physical deterioration and the difficult relationship that goes with that. At the moment, this bill doesn't allow that on the face of it. First point is, if it happens to someone with dementia who doesn't give consent, there's no way of knowing that's what happened, right? You can't do anything about it. And almost certainly there will be public demand, because it's quite logical to say that if I can give it to a relatively healthy person suffering with existential suffering, then why are we denying it in Canada, what's now a human right to death, to an early death? Why are we denying it to 14-year-olds with cancer whose parents disagree but the 14-year-old wants it, or 85-year-olds who've had 3 years of dementia, and I'm tired of it. And it's not going to be that difficult for me and the doctor to organise it.
Thank you, Kerry.
I just wanted to address the question that you asked, and it kind of concerns me. And we've talked a bit about people making assumptions on our behalf as patients, and I think the question that was asked is that the nurse had looked after close to 1,000 palliative care patients, and there was only one situation where she felt was hopeless. And I think that's the problem, is that you're outwardly looking in as opposed from the patient's perspective or the family's perspective. What does hopelessness or well-being or a dignified death look like? And this is what I think I've heard earlier. We shouldn't be making assumptions on behalf of people, and yet this does. My concern is that we spend too much time looking at it from a clinician's point of view, as opposed to engaging the patient, understanding their cultural context, understanding what does a dignified death look like for Māori. And I mentioned it before, Māori are not privileged in the health system. Māori are not benefited by giving, and sometimes the choice is taken from us whether or not we have access to treatment in a timely fashion, which leads us down the slippery slope of a very early death. So if there's an opportunity for a whānau to actually have self-determination and mana motuhake to control those last days and to have the whānau around, that is mana. That is a powerful relationship, and that is allowing whatever that whānau determines is a dignified exit.
Thank you, Kerry. Does anyone... Okay, Sarah in blue.
I'd like to ask the panellists, what do they think would happen to the grief experienced by the survivors of people who die as a result of assisted suicide that comes in New Zealand? My impression is, having been a general practitioner 30 years, palliative care, hospice doctor for 20, overlapping the two, is that whenever suicide enters the picture, the grief intensifies. And I see in this legislation the potential for family dissension. And I don't, like that idea. I'd like to hear what you folks have to say.
It's interesting. Sorry, can I just...
Okay, Claire, do you
Yeah.
first, then David?
I'd just like to quickly address that. When I made the decision for an assisted suicide death in Switzerland, I joined Dignitas so I could go over. And it was, I actually took my mum with me I attempted suicide. I went to the suicide outreach clinic and spoke to the psychologist there, and I told him my story, and he said to me, look, this is, if I was in your position, I would want to die, so I really think that this is something you should explore. Now, my mother came with me, and she was expecting them to say, well, wait a second, what's going wrong with your life here? What, are you sleeping? Ask all those sort of questions, which of course he didn't. When we came out of that interview, Mum looked at me and, I didn't care. I thought it was great. I was like, yeah, this is giving me permission, yay. And she since said to me afterwards, that completely broke her. That broke her heart. Because not only is she dealing with the grief of me being a tetraplegic, because of situations that happened, the background of my story, I was in a car accident, and I wasn't wearing a seatbelt, but my mum was driving. So there's a sense of guilt there. And this would have just put a nail in the coffin, to be honest, for her, and it would have destroyed her. And to be honest with you, it would have destroyed my family, and I didn't even think about that. I was so involved with my own pursuit of death because I was so unhappy that I didn't consider my family, because you just don't consider them. And the reality is, there will be family. It's like suicide. It is suicide. We can dress it up all we like, but just because a physician does it doesn't mean it's not suicide. And it will, and especially because family don't even need to be involved in the conversation. They'll find out that their daughter, I know we say grandparents all the time, but their daughter or their son chose suicide. How are they going to feel? It will destroy them, just as it destroyed my mother. She was heartbroken.
Jack in a minute, but David wanted to...
Yes, well, sir, thank you for your question. There is some empirical research and evidence into this. It's from Oregon, and it regards comparisons of people who commit suicide, as we think of it, people who are not dying, but irrationally choose to die, and assisted dying as would be allowed under this bill in its final form, which means that you have to find 2 doctors who are prepared to sign off on their professional career and future that you have, in their view, the likelihood of dying within 6 months. So you have to have a terminal medical condition to qualify for that. So you are dying. You most likely don't want to die, but you do want to control how it is. So right from that starting point, they're quite different scenarios. The evidence is that people do react very, very differently in each case, and for reasons you could probably surmise from the difference I've set out. But I think you're probably right that people's reaction will depend somewhat on your overall worldview, and perhaps particularly your spiritual worldview, towards the person's choice. And so if you are somebody who is absolutely opposed, if you're at the really extreme end of this debate and you believe that life is a miracle created by God that only God can take back, then you are never going to accept anybody, especially not somebody you're close to, choosing assisted death. And I guess the answer for those people is that you've got to reconcile those kinds of differences with people that you're close to. That's a private matter. On the other hand, if you're somebody more like me who says, look, I don't know all the answers, everyone has to choose their own path, and I respect you for who you are, and as long as you're not harming anyone else and there's no foul play, then I respect your choice, then you're probably going to be more comfortable with that. But it is, so two things, it's nothing like suicide as we generally think about it for reasons that I've outlined.
Thanks.
And secondly, I think you're right, it probably depends on your outlook, but as we know, New Zealanders are overwhelmingly in favour of choice on this issue.
Jack, you wanted to add something on this?
I'd just echo David's the manner of dying. Irrational suicide, unexpected for the relatives and those who love them, is extremely, puts them into extreme grief situations. But where the relatives are with the patient and the patient makes a request and they're awake and they have a peaceful death and a kind, compassionate death, the evidence is that the grieving is a lot easier.
What about relatives who are excluded by this?
We say?
The bill would tend to exclude some relatives.
The question was about excluding.
Well, I mean, I think that's a fair question, but under the status quo that we have now, if you've got a relative that maybe you should have been a bit kinder to, they may well not include you in the end of their life. They might not tell you they're in hospital. They might not want to see you.
I can tell you, a lived experience.
Excuse me, I've never talked over you in this debate. That's a problem that you have anyhow. But if anything, having this kind of bill in place at least gives people some safeguards and a framework that they can work through it with.
Thank you.
I'm going to just hold you. Go ahead.
Well, just telling the truth.
Well, no, I'm sorry, David, it doesn't, because, I mean, the reality is, yes, there will be a few that, and it's wonderful and they can get family involved, but I suspect the majority, as like myself and other vulnerable populations of people with severe disabilities, like myself, they won't necessarily talk to their family.
Well, it's not even talking to your family. So in Canada, I can tell you that it's extremely distressing for families to go through this. And there's often significant disagreement between family if the patient does talk to their loved ones. They don't agree, and there's lots of distress that then has to be dealt with again after the patient dies. So there's people that won't tell their family. That's one kind of distress. And then there's a lot of discord. Like you said, your mom, it would have totally broken her. And so this is the experience we live every day. We're accompanying patients who choose euthanasia, because I continue to provide palliative care for all those patients if they would like it. And so I can say how many families are distressed for different reasons. It's a huge amount, and it is building in the literature with current evidence base. This is a complicated grieving process. But not only the families, it's also the healthcare team that provides euthanasia to these patients. There's a growing body of evidence that even if you're morally in favor of providing it, it actually fundamentally changes who you are as a person. In the literature, it's called moral injury. And over time, including Quebec, we've only been doing it for 3 years in Quebec, there are fewer providers because of how it affects you. And it's not just the physician, even though the physician is on the hook, it's the bigger healthcare team. It's the cleaner who has to go in and clean the floor in that room after the person's euthanized. It's the nurses, it's the pharmacy techs who dispense the medication. The suffering is passed on, even if you're in favor, to the broader team and the family of that patient.
That segues into one of our reader questions. It says, what does the panel think of the impact of this legislation will have on the culture and practice of medicine in New Zealand? Do we have any
Well,
comments?
one of the concerning things is the looseness of the protection for those who don't want to do it. So what's happening in Canada is it's turning into quite a coercive framework where all institutions in some provinces are obliged to provide it. So the hospice it's quite likely a hospice won't be able to choose not to offer euthanasia because they get public funding. And the same for not just the doctors but also the nurses, where what's happened in some other places is while the law refers to their right to conscientious objection, their professional bodies, and David has said in some of the debates, the professional bodies will change their ethical frameworks once this law passes and then when it's defined as a health treatment, it becomes a matter of professional misconduct to deny it to a patient. And in Canada, the next version of that is that if someone is diagnosed with a significant illness, the physician will have a duty to inform them that they're eligible for euthanasia, and not to do so will be a matter of professional misconduct. And this is all in a profession which, for all the time we've always had it, it was always there to protect life, not to take it. You know, and we've had some people in these debates say, why do the doctors have to do it? Why don't the lawyers do it? I've got a good idea. Why don't the MPs do it? Well, they're going to vote for it. They're the people who take the action to cross the line. Why aren't they, you get 6 weeks training, all is an injection. Apparently there's no complications about it.
You don't have to train in Canada.
And don't even train them. Just let them loose.
So David,
Of course it'll change the culture because it will set doctor against doctor. In one room you're trying to save a life, in the other room you're not just medically, all these subtle, lovely little definitions that we're getting now. It's irrational suicide as opposed to, rational suicide, which high-income educated people do. In the next door, they're killing people. That's what changes. The doctor is now licensed to kill. It happens they need the consent of the patient. They should have got the consent, but nevertheless, they're killing them. Here's a question. What do vets think about it? Vets are the other euthanasias in our society. And if you go through the submissions, there's 17 vets who have submitted, and guess what? Only 14 of them submitted against the bill. There's a high rate of suicide among vets. Have you ever put down a dog? They look you in the eye and they know you're going to do it. And I'm not joking. It gets to the vets and they're doing it to animals.
thank you. David, did you want to respond?
Yeah, just quickly, I did a bit of mental arithmetic, and I think that means 17% of vets that submitted were in favour. Well, only 10% of the overall population, so from what Bill's told us, vets are more likely to be in favour than the rest of the population, but that's just a bit of quick mental arithmetic. Look, I'm going to have to send Bill a copy of the bill because I don't think he's read it. The bill is very clear that it says nobody may be forced to undertake an act under this bill or this act to which they have a conscientious objection. So the idea that a doctor is required to tell people they're eligible, well, that's simply not true. The law says, in black and white, if you are a doctor and you have a conscientious objection, then and your patient comes and says, look, I'm a bit interested in assisted dying, You are entitled to say to them, I have a conscientious objection, you must talk to the Ministry of Health. That's all the law
you have to
requires
refer them.
do.
You
No,
have
you
to
don't.
refer them
No.
to the killing machine.
No, oh God, look, this is just...
You have to refer them.
Oh my
Is
God.
it, David, is it true?
I'm sorry.
David, is it true you have to refer
No,
them?
you do not.
You do.
No, you don't.
You do. That's exactly what it says.
The bill says very clearly that the doctor must say, I have a conscientious objection, you must talk to SCENS, which is actually a department.
Which is the euthanasia department.
You must tell them that you have to contact. Now,
It's the euthanasia department.
Alrighty, they'll come down. Now, nobody in their right mind, and especially not a doctor that wanted to keep their practicing certificate, would ever refer to that as a referral.
I would.
You have to give them.
I would.
I've heard enough from you.
No,
Well, you have to give one piece of publicly available information. That is not a referral. But let's get down to the real evidence, because it's always easy to have speculation and fear and uncertainty and doubt about what might happen. The question was what will happen with the medical profession. And there is actually good evidence from overseas where it's actually happened, not where what Bill says it's going to be referred to the killing machine. I mean, not Bill's version of reality, but actual reality in countries that have allowed assisted dying to happen. And there's two questions. What is the public perception of doctors? What is public trust in the medical profession? Is it lower in countries that have legalised assisted dying? From everything that we're hearing, you would think so, but that is simply not true. If anything, it is slightly higher. Secondly,
Where are you getting this information? Because
Yeah.
I'm living it in
very
Canada, and I can tell you that patients don't trust us.
Well,
and there's
I'm very happy to send you the
say-
studies after the debate, but if I can just finish this
would
point.
be good, because I don't think that's evidence-based.
All right, can I continue?
Sure, go
All
ahead.
right.
Yeah.
Second of all, you've got to ask the question not only what happens to trust in doctors, but what happens with the quality of palliative care in the country. And again, you might ask yourself, is it the truth that countries that have legalised assisted dying have worse quality of palliative care or better? And again, there are some countries with assisted dying that are better than countries without, and some slightly worse. There is no pattern, but on balance, Belgium and the Netherlands and Switzerland generally have slightly better palliative care as assessed by international bodies in comparison with their neighbours such as the UK and France that don't. So, the question is what happens to the medical profession, and once you get through all the speculation which we've heard and is easily debunked, frankly, then you look at what happens overseas, and doctors are as trusted, if not more so, and palliative care is as good or better. These are the facts, and once you start having the debate on the basis of what actually happens overseas, it's a very different debate from the one you heard from Bill tonight.
Well, I can tell you what's been actually happening in Canada, and that is we have less access to palliative care resources. There's been no net new funding for palliative care in Canada, and in fact, in some provinces, palliative care funding is being used to fund euthanasia. So we have the same amount of funding coming to a province, and then end-of-life care is lumping together palliative care and euthanasia, and there are nurse practitioners in the province of Ontario who do both. That's their designated job. They provide palliative care and euthanasia, and so we effectively have reduced access to palliative care because now the same funding in the same position is providing euthanasia as well as palliative care. So in Canada, the reality is there's not been increased access to palliative care resources. In fact, there's less access, and the College of Medicine in Quebec has shown that there are fewer people practicing as palliative medicine physicians because of the way euthanasia is being forced onto hospices and palliative care units. Is against the philosophy of palliative care. Very difficult to be a palliative care physician when you're being forced to do something that's against your conscience. And there are fewer physicians training to be palliative medicine specialists or even palliative care, primary care providers. So we have in Quebec showing, and it's probably consistent in the rest of Canada, but at least I have data to say in Quebec there are fewer practitioners, and the College of Medicine has actually wrote a statement saying that they are very concerned that Quebec persons are choosing euthanasia because they do not have access to palliative care. So we have less resources, and I would actually love to see those studies from the Netherlands and Belgium, because to my reading of the evidence, there's also been no increase in palliative care resources in any of those countries either.
That's rubbish. They have.
I'm really conscious of time, and I know there's a lot of questions that will probably go unanswered tonight because I see a lot of hands. What we might do is get to continue this debate. We will get you to submit your questions to me, and we will keep the conversation going. I would like to give everyone a chance to sum up briefly, please. Just your takeaways and your thoughts on the discussion tonight, and how you think the conversation is progressing. Kerry, could we start with you, perhaps?
Sure. Look, our primary role was to protect the role of nurses within any legislation that may well roll out into the future. The problem that we've had and faced previously is legislation has happened and we've just inherited stuff. So this was a proactive, principled approach to make sure the role of the professional role of nurses is maintained. We saw this as an opportunity, similarly, that nurses must have the right to opt out, to not participate in decisions, to end life, very similarly to what they do with late terminations of pregnancies, that we must have an opportunity for the nurse not to be engaged if they feel that it morally compromises their ethical or cultural position. So our role was to ensure the protection of nurses moving forward. As I said, I represent a large group of Māori nurses throughout the country whose role is to engage within the communities. And I know that we've had a lot of discussion around some of the cultural gaps, some of the professional competencies around dealing with culture and being brave enough to engage in that conversation. It happens now. Whether or not this legislation or this bill gets passed, there must be an opportunity to have that wider discussion. Because at the moment, this westernised model is compromising the culture of tangata whenua Māori and not allowing us the ability to have a discussion. We talk about death and dying regularly. We're not afraid of death and dying. Sometimes I think that the Western world view compartmentalises death as opposed to us seeing it as a holistic place, a holistic growth and well-being. As I said, in our whakatauki, we're all born to die. We plan our death as part of that. Engagement and discussion and consultation with whānau is key to that. And the nurse's role is often, unfortunately, the first person that patients engage with around that discussion.
Thank you, Kerry. Claire, what's your takeaways from this evening?
Sure. I mean, I'll just keep saying that, you know, I was obviously very pro-euthanasia when I wanted that done, when I wasn't getting the support. And interestingly, I was actually in an awful lot of pain as well. And that was an environmental issue for me. I guess it just scares me. It scares me because I do know of a lot of people that will take this bill up because they do qualify under the current criteria, and even if it becomes a terminal illness, it's still, you know, I mean, I could become terminal, to be honest with you, quite quickly if that's what I choose, if I say no to treatment. But I just want to push the point that, you know, yeah, there'll be people like Lucretia Seals and there'll be those cases, but we need to look at the bigger picture and look at who will also be affected by this bill. And I'm saying that there is a huge portion of incredibly vulnerable disabled people that will choose this bill to kill themselves during moments of great pain and great weakness and great suffering. And I want to say is, you know, what I want to say is that, you know, that is an often a temporary state, and you can move past that, you know, with the right support, with the right medication. But, you know, we're up against, you know, we're up against a hill. It's very difficult for us to express our points of view because it's, you know, it is a difficult topic, and it is one where I know a lot of people would take it up, but, you know, who are disabled. But, yeah, it's just, I can see it happening to people, friends of mine, and they will choose to end their lives prematurely. And that is, that scares me, because that's the reality of the situation. That's the reality of this bill.
Thanks, Claire. Dr. Herx, your perspectives as
Sure,
a visiting guest.
Yeah, so I would say visiting guest, but also a person that's have lived experience for almost 3 years working as a physician in a system that offers legalized euthanasia. And I don't like the term medical assistance in dying, because that's actually what I do every day as a palliative care physician. I help people die and live well until they die. So it's actually a euphemism, and we need to call it what it is, and it's euthanasia. So in my lived experience in Canada is that you think that you have this all nicely contained in this tidy package of legislation that says a terminal condition, but and a 6-month prognosis. First of all, I think it's very difficult to predict a 6-month prognosis, and we have, in cancer even, we can't get it right, because now we have all kinds of new immunotherapy treatments that are changing the way natural progression of these diseases go. It's very impossible to predict 6 months. So I think there's going to be challenges from the very beginning, even if you limit it to 6 months, but there's really no piece of legislation that you can put in that will not change over time, because that's what's happened in all the other countries. And I respect the fact that we have a different process with the court system and constitution in Canada, but all the other countries, especially who've legalized euthanasia, which is what this bill involves, is not restricted to assisted suicide, where patients ingest their own oral medication. It will change over time. It becomes a therapeutic medical service. It will become a human right, and everyone will say, well, why am I not eligible? And over time, the legislation will get revised, and you'll be talking about the things we're talking about in Canada that we never expected to be having this discussion 2.5 years later. It's almost 3 years, but that's a short period of time to go from having what we thought was this tight bundle to having, now we're talking about how we will provide euthanasia for mature minors. It's true, it's not happening yet, but it's coming, and mental health. And now we no longer have reasonably foreseeable death as part of the requirement. There's no requirement for prognosis in Canada. You are very similar to us. David Seymour has already made much reference to Canada. We are very similar healthcare system. We are very, very similar in the proposed legislation and our current legislation. And we're very similar in our society and our values, I think. And you have a chance to do things, you have a chance to not do this, do things differently. Then we did not have that opportunity in Canada with the way the Supreme Court mandated the legislation to be put in place. We didn't have a say as doctors. We didn't have a say as a society. You guys can choose to do something differently, and I encourage you to become informed and find out what this really means, and that this doesn't stay in this nice tidy box. You can't put the genie back in the bottle. Thank you.
Dr. Havel, your thoughts?
I must say I'm rather disturbed by the sort of a mixture of misinformation we've had from some people tonight, and also the polarised view and forthright views that don't really stand up to what this bill is about. I think one day we're going to look back and think, why on earth did we let so many people suffer at the end of their life when they're dying anyway in those last few weeks? 70% of the patients are cancer. They're dying of cancer, and they're in a deep state of incapacity. They're in palliative care in hospices because everybody knows that they're dying of cancer. And some of them are having a really bad time. And okay, you can go 2 tracks. You can go to deep sedation and palliative care to overcome all the various aspects of suffering, or you could have, at the patient's request, while they're still conscious and wanting, and with the family around, have assisted dying. Now, I think in the future we'll see this synergy of palliative care and hospices with assisted dying, and it'll happen. And it's happening, for instance, in Canada, in Victoria, in Victoria Hospital. already, palliative care physicians.
Yeah, 8% of Canadian palliative care physicians are willing to provide euthanasia. We have surveyed our membership.
What I'm
so
saying,
we're talking about a few people,
hang on,
not the majority.
I didn't interrupt you. I didn't interrupt you.
Well, I just want to make sure
So-
people hear the facts and not stuff that's not true.
What I'm saying is it's starting, and it's going to be a continuum, and in the future it'll happen, and I think that will be the best result long term. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Havel. Sybil, your thoughts, please.
Yeah, there's a reason. One of the reasons we're having this debate now is because every other time, and in most other countries, we've got this thing about killing people. You know, it might be a bit irrational, but we've always found it hard to cross that line. And the reason we find it hard to enable killing is because we all know it's dangerous. We all know it's dangerous. That's why the bill has so-called safeguards, right? So even Mr. Seymour, by the way he's written the bill, acknowledges this is a very dangerous thing to do, and he's tried to construct a set of rules to, I mean, what are safeguards for? They're for protecting people, right? So we've got common ground here. This is a very dangerous thing to do, and the proponents of the bill know that. Okay, they know that. And the dangers have become manifest in every place that they put it in. And what are those dangers? Well, some of them are obvious. People just don't keep the rules and you can do nothing about it. And some of them are a bit more subtle, which is about the type of community you want to be. And that is, do you want people with disability to feel scared? Do you want young people who do have existential suffering at the age of 18 to be confused about their community's attitude to suicide? You know, that some of it's rational, but theirs is irrational. And I know 18-year-olds, they're not that subtle on the philosophy about this stuff. You know, you do it or you don't, you got caught or you didn't. So if you're going to take this step, and I mean, I'm obviously absolutely opposed to taking that step, then if choice is the driver, you've got to do two things. One is, if choice is the driver, why have any rules? If it's really seriously about autonomy, why have any rules at all? Just say, all doctors are immune from prosecution if they kill someone who asks them. Well, again, we know they've got rules. Now, it could be a cynical political manoeuvre by the pro-euthanasia people. I think it is a genuine understanding of the dangers. And those dangers are people not keeping the rules, but it's the more subtle ones. It is the sense that we've mandated the taking of lives that fit some definition where we won't take other lives. And the lives that fit those some definitions are always vulnerable people. And we see that in the current law. The terminally ill, they're vulnerable, that's for sure. And there's a lot of them who don't want euthanasia. They don't want that doctor coming in. In fact, in Canada, some of them turn down the pain relief because they're not sure what's in this hypodermic. And you get an assumption in the disability community that their life is worth less because they're defined in legislation as people who can choose to get killed. And that's not the kind of country that I think you want to be. You want to be the kind of country where the vulnerable people, who aren't the 70%, be absolutely clear about that, there's not 70% of them, but the standard here is pretty high. There cannot be one wrongful death. There cannot be one. And when Mr. Seymour was asked about that the other night on TV, you know what he said? No law is perfect. Well, that imperfection is your daughter.
If you said that to a cardiac surgeon, that they could never have a death, that means, on that logic, they would never be able to operate on cardiac patients.
So we've now got endorsement from Dr. Havel. We're passing legislation which will result in wrongful death, and therefore I'm absolutely opposed to it.
Thank you, Sybil. Thank you. David Seymour.
Totally
Bill,
illogical.
What are your thoughts after this evening?
Well, it was interesting to listen to Bill just now. Suggests that if we legalise assisted dying, there'll be an increase in youth suicide. Now, During the...
I didn't say that.
Yes, he did. Yes,
No, he didn't.
Absolutely.
The audience is wrong.
His exact words.
I said confused about our attitude
Yep.
to it.
And why would it be important that they'd be confused about their attitude, other than it might lead to them doing it? So he did say that. I'm
You
sorry,
said it,
but
no,
he
you
didn't
said
mean
it.
it to come out, but it came out. And the interesting thing about that is that during the election campaign, when Bill was still Prime Minister, one of the National Party candidates made that exact argument, and Bill said it was reprehensible and disgraceful.
Yeah, and I was wrong.
It's funny how things
I was
change.
wrong.
It's funny how things change. And the fact is, and I'll just give you this one little bit of evidence, that people have studied this all over the world, and the Ministry of Health has issued a report in our Parliament, and there is no connection between legalising assisted death and youth suicide. Those are the facts. And I raise that because it's part of a pattern that we've had tonight, where we've had endless speculation, fear, uncertainty and doubt that collapses as soon as you go to the hard evidence of what happens overseas. But there are really two important questions here. And well, actually, let me just tell you another little story about when Bill and I were working together on charter schools, and the opponents of charter schools brought out from central casting the absolutely classic American woman. She was the person you'd expect.
David, is this getting back to
yeah, it is. Yeah, it's a good story. And she came out and she said, "We don't want no charter schools where I'm from." And she went on TV, and the New Zealand public thought that must be what Americans think. Well, we did a bit of research into her. She ran for a local school board, and she didn't get elected. She came third and last with 10% of the vote. And actually, where she was from, charter schools were very popular. Now, I just give you that thought because I lived in Canada for 5 years, and I know many Canadian friends. And if you were to ask them about the version of events in Canada you've had from Leone tonight, they would wonder what on earth you were talking about.
So what does it mean for us here?
Can we get back to a couple of the questions that really need to be answered in this debate? Number one, is the status quo acceptable? And I think New Zealanders have spoken. The fact that 70%, sometimes 75%, depending on exactly the poll, want assisted dying to be legalised, and they want choice.
90%
is
of the
because
don't want it, David.
Yeah, and that's a self-selecting survey, and if you know about statistics, you know that's
Okay.
What about the gun laws?
so people want assisted dying in New Zealand because they've seen the status quo and they don't think that it's acceptable. That's a fact. I know it's uncomfortable for some people in this room, but that's a fact. People have seen the status quo and they don't want it. They want change. That's why we're here. Number two, is it possible to design a law that gives choice to those who want it while keeping those who want nothing to do with it perfectly safe? And the answer from Bill English is no. But the answer from the Supreme Court of Canada is yes. The answer from the Quebec
lived
Select
experience
Committee
is not
yes.
that. It is a no.
Excuse me.
No, I'm not going to excuse you because you're wrong. It is a no.
Okay, well, Carter versus Canada can be looked up on the internet and read, and I think
David,
people
can we
reach their own
bring it
conclusion.
back to New Zealand and just your final thoughts, please?
As soon as I stop getting interrupted. So the question is, okay, is it possible to design a law that gives choice to those who want it and protection to those who don't? The
No.
Supreme Court of Canada says yes.
No.
The Western Australian Parliament is the most recent to say yes. Crown Law and the Attorney General revising my bill against the Bill of Rights Act 1990, which is done for bills in New Zealand, extensively examined it and said yes. So my contention is that we need change because what people are put through at the moment is frankly in many cases barbaric, even with the best of palliative care. And secondly, according to people who have looked at this in a rigorous way and don't rave and fearmonger, actually it is possible to design legislation that gives safety and protection to those who want nothing to do with it and choice to those who do. Those are the facts from around the world, and that is why this bill needs to become a law and why New Zealanders should join 150 million others around the world who have choice. Thank you very much.
I'd like everyone to give our panellists a very warm round of applause.